In May 1941, when Republic Aviation rolled out the prototype of the P-47 Thunderbolt, even its supporters hesitated to call it beautiful. It was huge by fighter standards, 10 tons at full load, a span that seemed to stretch across the hangar, and a fuselage so thick that mechanics joked it could survive a mid-air collision with a barn. To many pilots who had grown up with the lean lines of the Spitfire or the nimble P-40, the new machine looked like a mistake cast in aluminum. Yet, the war that was already burning across Europe would demand something very different from beauty. The Luftwaffe dominated the continent. Its Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s had proved that speed and climb were essential, but survivability was beginning to matter even more. British and American bombers would soon have to cross hundreds of miles of enemy territory. They would need an escort that could not only keep pace, but also withstand punishment and bring its pilot home. The Thunderbolt, for all its bulk, was a child of necessity. Its heart was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial that generated more than 2,000 horsepower, one of the most powerful piston engines ever built. Around that engine, Republic's designers constructed an aircraft that was essentially a flying engine with wings attached, a thick fuselage to accommodate the turbo supercharger ducts, a spacious cockpit high above the wing root, and a landing gear strong enough to support the weight of a small truck. When test flights began, skepticism deepened. The Thunderbolt climbed slowly, burned fuel voraciously, and handled like a freight car below 10,000 feet. "It's a monster," one early pilot remarked, "and I'm not sure it wants to fly." Even the United States Army Air Forces seemed doubtful. The P-38 Lightning and the forthcoming P-51 Mustang looked far more promising on paper, both faster and longer ranged. But the engineers at Republic, led by Alexander Kartveli, understood something that the critics did not. The P-47's size was not a flaw, it was the foundation of a concept that would dominate the air war over Europe: power plus resilience. They reasoned that in combat, what kept a pilot alive was not agility alone, but the ability to absorb damage and keep fighting. By 1942, the United States had entered the war, and the first production P-47Bs began arriving at training fields. Ground crews were astonished by its complexity. The turbo supercharger system wound through the fuselage in a maze of pipes. Maintenance manuals ran hundreds of pages. Yet when pilots took it aloft and learned its temperament, attitudes began to change. At altitude, where the thin air robbed other fighters of their strength, the Thunderbolt came alive. Its massive engine and supercharger maintained full power above 30,000 feet, allowing it to climb higher and dive faster than almost anything in the sky. In level flight, it could exceed 400 miles per hour, comparable to the feared FW-190. More importantly, it could dive past 500 miles per hour without structural failure, a feat few others dared attempt. Still, its critics remained vocal. European airmen, especially the Germans, mocked the ungainly newcomer. Ein fliegendes Bierfass, they called it, a flying beer barrel. Luftwaffe intelligence reports dismissed the P-47 as too heavy to dogfight and too short-ranged to escort bombers. The ridicule was echoed even among Allied pilots, many of whom requested assignment to the sleeker Mustangs instead. That laughter would not last long. The Thunderbolt entered combat in April 1943 with the 56th Fighter Group, based at Halesworth, England. Their mission was to provide high-altitude escort for 8th Air Force bombers striking industrial targets deep in Germany. Early sorties were discouraging. The P-47's limited range forced it to turn back over the Netherlands, leaving the bombers unprotected during the most dangerous part of their journey. Losses among the B-17s were heavy. Yet, even in those first months, Luftwaffe pilots began to notice that the new American fighter was strangely hard to kill. Machine gun rounds that would shred a Spitfire merely dented the Thunderbolt's skin. Its thick armor protected the pilot from frontal and rear attacks. Its radial engine could keep running after absorbing hits that would have destroyed a liquid-cooled engine. On several occasions, P-47s returned to base with cylinders shot away, hydraulics severed, and control cables barely holding, but they returned. The Americans learned to use the aircraft's mass as a weapon. Instead of tight dogfights, Thunderbolt pilots preferred boom and zoom tactics, diving from altitude, unleashing devastating bursts from their 8.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, and then climbing away before the enemy could respond. The pattern exploited both the aircraft's speed in a dive and its ruggedness on egress. Each of those Brownings could fire roughly 850 rounds per minute. Together, they poured a river of metal that could tear apart anything unlucky enough to be in the cone of fire. German pilots who once laughed at the Thunderbolt found themselves flying through storms of tracer rounds that turned the sky into a furnace. By the summer of 1943, the Thunderbolt's reputation had changed. Reports from both sides painted a picture of a new menace in the western sky. The Luftwaffe instructed its pilots to avoid engaging P-47s in steep dives. Few aircraft could follow them without breaking apart.
At the same time, American commanders worked to extend the fighters' range with drop tanks, gradually pushing the escort line deeper into Europe. In September, Captain Hubert "Hub" Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, began refining tactics that would make the Thunderbolt legendary. His pilots climbed to altitudes above the bomber stream and then dove upon German interceptors from the sun, using the P-47's superior high-speed performance to dictate the engagement. Zemke insisted on discipline. No turning dogfights, no heroics, just controlled attacks and energy management. The results were dramatic. Within months, the 56th Group became the highest-scoring unit in the 8th Air Force. Pilots like Francis S. Gabreski, Robert Johnson, and Dave Schilling carved their names into history, each achieving more than 20 aerial victories. The German laughter vanished. In its place came respect tinged with fear. One captured Luftwaffe officer summarized it bluntly. "We thought it was a joke. Then we saw what 8 machine guns could do." By late 1943, the P-47 Thunderbolt had transformed from a curiosity into the backbone of America's fighter command in Europe. Every squadron that flew her came to understand the paradox at the heart of her design. She was heavy but quick, cumbersome on takeoff but graceful in a dive, crude in looks but subtle in performance. In the same way the war was teaching the Allies to fight, the Thunderbolt was teaching its own pilots patience, discipline, and faith in engineering. At Halesworth, Boxstead, and later at forward airfields in France, ground crews called the P-47 Jug, short for Juggernaut, though officially for Jug. It fit the machine's demeanor. From the moment its Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine coughed into life, the earth seemed to tremble. Mechanics wore ear protection long before it was standard issue. The double-row radial emitted a deep, pulsing roar that rolled across the airfield like a thunderclap. When fully armed and fueled, the aircraft weighed more than 8 tons, twice that of some enemy fighters. Getting it airborne required confidence. The long takeoff run, the slow lift, the sense that the ground was reluctant to let go. Yet once it climbed into the thin air above 20,000 feet, the weight fell away. The turbo supercharger came into its own, forcing compressed air into the cylinders, and the aircraft surged forward with new life. At 30,000 feet, the Jug was king. Few could touch it there. Combat over Europe was no longer romantic. Gone were the swirling duels of 1940. The War of 1943 and 1944 was fought in coordinated formations, by radio command and radar direction. The P-47 groups learned to operate as hunters in packs. They moved ahead of the bomber streams, sweeping the air routes clean. Their job was not only to escort, but to dominate. On 26 November 1943, during a mission to Bremen, the 56th Fighter Group met nearly 60 German interceptors.
The engagement lasted less than 20 minutes. When the Thunderbolts returned, they claimed 31 kills for the loss of one pilot. German records later confirmed most of the losses. It was the moment when the Luftwaffe understood that the American fighter arm was no longer a nuisance,
but a rival power in the air. The P-47's 8 Brownings earned a reputation of their own. Each .5 caliber slug carried the kinetic energy of a rifle bullet times 20. In a 1-second burst, a Thunderbolt could fire more than 100 rounds, enough to saw the wing off a Bf-109 or set a bomber ablaze. Gun camera film from the period shows enemy aircraft disintegrating under the concentrated impact, fragments spiraling away as the jug pulled upward through the debris. The Thunderbolt's greatest gift to its pilots was forgiveness. It could take damage that would have destroyed almost any other fighter. The radial engine, lacking the vulnerable coolant lines of liquid-cooled aircraft, could survive hits that would have caused a Mustang or a Spitfire to seize instantly. Pilots returned with half their cylinders shot out, controls barely responding, wings shredded. The fuselage, thick with armor plate, protected the cockpit like a fortress. Robert S. Johnson became the legend that defined this resilience. In June 1943, his P-47 was hit repeatedly by a German FW-190. Cannon shells smashed into the wings and fuselage, hydraulic fluid sprayed across the cockpit. Johnson's canopy jammed, his elevator cables were severed, yet the Thunderbolt refused to die. Even as the German pilot closed in for the kill, Johnson's crippled machine stayed aloft, shaking and smoking. When he finally limped back across the channel, engineers counted more than 200 bullet holes. The aircraft was still technically airworthy. Stories like his spread rapidly through both Allied and German units. The myth of invincibility began to attach itself to the Thunderbolt, and with myth came morale. The Luftwaffe learned that it could not simply rely on outclimbing or outturning the American. It had to destroy him utterly, or he would be back the next day. By early 1944, the P-47's one great flaw, its range, was being solved. External drop tanks, first of 75 gallons, then 108, and eventually 150, extended its patrol distance well into the heart of Germany. The 8th Air Force began to send Thunderbolts deeper with each raid. Berlin was no longer beyond reach. Bomber crews who had once faced unopposed swarms of FW-190s now saw friendly contrails above them all the way home. The Luftwaffe, already bleeding from the Eastern Front, was forced into a war of attrition it could not win. Every German pilot lost represented experience that could not be replaced. Every American lost was backed by a replacement pipeline and a new aircraft waiting on the dock. Industrial arithmetic was beginning to decide the sky. With the arrival of the longer-ranged P-51 Mustang, many assumed the Thunderbolt's day was done. Yet the air war was changing. The Allies no longer needed only escorts, they needed hammers.
As the invasion of Normandy approached, the focus shifted from dogfighting to ground attack, and here the Thunderbolt found its second destiny. Its strong wings could carry rockets, bombs, and napalm canisters in addition to its guns. Its radial engine and thick armor allowed it to dive through anti-aircraft fire and still climb out again. Pilots began to refer to it as a flying artillery piece. Low over France, Belgium, and later Germany itself, the P-47 became the scourge of locomotives, convoys, and troop columns. Its 8 machine guns shredded anything soft. Its 500-pound bombs and high-velocity rockets demolished bridges and tanks. In these missions, precision was less important than persistence. Thunderbolts flew dozens of sorties per day, their engines screaming, their fuselages streaked with exhaust. The Luftwaffe, crippled by fuel shortages and constant bombing, could seldom respond. The air war had tilted irreversibly. German fighter pilots, once contemptuous, came to dread the P-47's silhouette. In post-war interviews, many admitted that they avoided combat with it unless they held the advantage of altitude and numbers. Quote, "It could outdive anything we had, and when it came up firing, the sky turned into flame," recalled one FW-190 veteran. Ground troops learned the same lesson. From Normandy onward, the Thunderbolt's growl became a sound of terror to those below. Its machine guns raked columns of vehicles, its bombs cratered roads and railways. The psychological effect was profound. Wehrmacht reports from the summer of 1944 describe units refusing to move by day because of, quote, "continuous fighter-bomber activity." The aircraft that had been laughed at as too big, too slow, too crude, had become one of the decisive instruments of Allied power.
Too slow, too crude, had become one of the decisive instruments of Allied power. By the summer of 1944, the Allied armies had broken through at Normandy. Air superiority was now an American birthright. Every advance on the ground was mirrored by a constant rumble overhead. P-47 sweeping low, strafing roads, cutting rail lines, hunting armor. The Germans still fought fiercely, but the sky was no longer theirs. The Luftwaffe, once the symbol of blitzkrieg, had become a shadow, an exhausted force forced to fight on its own ruined airfields. The P-47's transformation from interceptor to fighter bomber was the natural outcome of its design. The same strength that had made it a lumbering dogfighter made it nearly indestructible under flak. Its thick radial engine could absorb direct hits from 20mm shells and still deliver power. Its wings, built like bridges, carried bombs heavier than the aircraft's original designers had ever intended. When Allied planners studied ground attack statistics, the numbers told their own story. A single P-47 could destroy more vehicles, locomotives, and artillery pieces in one sortie than entire bomber formations could manage in an hour. The pilots of the 9th Air Force, who flew close support for ground troops, developed new tactics, long, shallow dives that allowed the pilot to see and aim, low-level approaches that made enemy gunners shoot too late. They called it train busting or tank plinking, a grim humor masking the intensity of the work. German soldiers quickly learned to recognize the Thunderbolt sound before they could see it. It began as a distant growl, then a deepening rumble that seemed to shake the ground. The engine's supercharger, screaming under load, added a metallic whine that echoed between valleys. Donnerschlag, thunderclap, was what the troops called it. Those who survived attacks described the noise as a physical force, pressing against the chest as the aircraft dived, guns blazing.
In those final years, no corner of occupied Europe felt safe. Rail lines, once the arteries of German logistics, became death traps. Even solitary locomotives were hunted down. Bridges that survived bombing raids were cut by fighter bombers. The German command, already stretched thin by losses in Russia, could no longer move troops or fuel in daylight. While the pilots of the Luftwaffe struggled to find enough gasoline for a single sortie, American airfields in France and Belgium roared day and night. Each Thunderbolt could fly multiple missions in a day, attack, refuel, reload, and be airborne again within an hour. The aircraft's rugged radial engine required minimal maintenance even after sustained punishment. Mechanics learned to love its reliability. They called it the farmer's airplane because it could take rough handling and keep working. It was not unusual for a P-47 to come back with dozens of holes in its wings, oil leaking down the fuselage, and still be flight ready by evening. The ground crew's skill and the aircraft's durability made an inseparable partnership. The machine was an extension of industrial logic, every part designed for mass production, every component interchangeable. When one was lost, another could take its place within days. Then came the winter of 1944-45 and the Battle of the Bulge. The German counteroffensive in the Ardennes caught the Allies off guard. For a brief moment, The weather favored the Wehrmacht. Snow, fog, and low cloud grounded Allied aircraft. But when the skies cleared in late December, vengeance came on silver wings.
Thunderbolts swarmed the roads leading east. Columns of German armor, trapped by lack of fuel and congested roads, became perfect targets. The Jug's 8 Brownings made short work of half-tracks, trucks, and anti-aircraft guns. Its 5-inch rockets punched through tank armor with terrifying ease. A single squadron could stop a battalion's advance in minutes. The Luftwaffe attempted to protect its ground troops with desperate sorties, but few aircraft survived long enough to make a difference. Major George Bostwick, a veteran of the 56th Fighter Group, described the scene in his diary. It was like a shooting gallery, only everything shot back. The roads were black with vehicles, the woods full of smoke. We went in at tree height, pulled out over treetops, and went back in again. I remember the smell of burnt rubber and gasoline, even through the cockpit glass. As 1945 began, the Thunderbolt's crews were as hardened as the machines they flew. They had learned to fight in all weather, to take off from muddy forward strips barely long enough for their weight, and to navigate by dead reckoning through snow and rain. Losses still came, flak remained deadly, but each sortie eroded what little was left of Germany's ability to resist. By March, when Allied forces crossed the Rhine, the Luftwaffe was effectively finished. Those German pilots who still flew often did so with barely trained replacements. They called it Fliegen in den Tod, flying to death. Facing Thunderbolts and Mustangs in the same sky, most never returned.
The statistics tell part of the story. By the end of the war in Europe, Thunderbolt pilots had destroyed more than 7,000 enemy aircraft in the air and tens of thousands on the ground. They had dropped over 130,000 tons of bombs. No other Allied fighter type inflicted as much total damage on German forces. Yet the numbers cannot fully explain the transformation that took place. In 1943, German aces had laughed at the ungainly American newcomer. By 1945, the sound of its 8 Brownings opening fire was enough to make entire convoys scatter in panic. The P-47 had turned ridicule into retribution through the sheer force of engineering and adaptation. When the war finally ended, the few surviving Luftwaffe officers who examined captured Thunderbolts were astonished at their construction. They found systems redundant to a degree unknown in German aircraft, electrical wiring labeled for quick repair, and armor integrated into the structure rather than added as an afterthought. It is the product of a nation that thinks in factories, one engineer reportedly said. That was the true lesson of the P-47. It was not merely a fighter, but a manifestation of industrial warfare. The idea that machines could be multiplied faster than they could be destroyed, and that strength could compensate for elegance. The Germans, for all their brilliance in design, could never match that logic. Their aircraft were built like instruments. The Thunderbolt was built like a tool. And tools, when wielded by enough hands, shape history.
When the guns fell silent in May 1945, Europe was a continent of smoke and ruin. Across its shattered towns and fields lay the burned remains of thousands of machines, tanks, trucks, aircraft, all testament to a war fought on an industrial scale. Among them, resting on muddy airstrips and steel-planked runways, were rows of P-47 Thunderbolts, their once shining aluminum skins dulled by oil, exhaust, and time. The pilots who stepped down from them were weary, older than their years, and yet aware that they had flown one of the defining weapons of the modern age. No one had expected the Thunderbolt to become a legend. It was never graceful like the Spitfire, never sleek like the Mustang. It lacked the romance of the Messerschmitt or the menace of the Focke-Wulf. It was, instead, a masterpiece of practicality, born not from artistic vision, but from the engineering mind of Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian immigrant who believed that power and survivability were the keys to winning the skies.
The P-47 story was proof that beauty is not always found in form, but in function. In a world that had glorified speed and finesse, it was brute endurance that prevailed. Its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, its thick armor, its 8.5 caliber guns, all of it represented a single idea, that the best weapon is the one that comes home. The Thunderbolt did more than survive. It endured the worst conditions of the European war and came back for more. Its pilots learned to trust it as they would a comrade. Many owed their lives to its toughness.
More than a few returned to base on one engine cylinder or half a wing, guided home by will and luck while the Jug roared stubbornly through the sky. Ask any surviving pilot what it felt like to fly the Jug, and their words converge around one theme: confidence. You could dive at 500 miles an hour and feel it hold together. You could take flak hits that would tear lighter planes apart and still make it back to friendly lines. Its cockpit was roomy, its controls solid, its roll rate steady. It wasn't a dancer, one veteran said, but it was a brawler, and in a fight, that's what counted. For many, the P-47 became more than a weapon. It became a companion. Pilots named them like ships: Big Ass Bird 2, Little Chief, Bonnie, Ol' Cock 3rd. Nose art covered the cowlings, each one a reflection of home, humor, or heartbreak. Mechanics painted pinup girls, playing cards, or hometown flags. The machines became extensions of identity, reflections of the men who flew them through fire and steel. After the war, the world changed almost overnight. Jet engines replaced pistons, propellers gave way to turbines, and aircraft design leapt forward in a single decade. Yet the Thunderbolt did not vanish quietly. It served in the air forces of France, Mexico, Brazil, and many newly independent nations. In Latin America, it patrolled borders and flew for years after its designers thought it obsolete. In the 1950s, Jugs still thundered over Korea in the colors of allied nations, proving that old power could still deliver punishment. Its successor, the Republic F-84 Thunderjet, carried forward its lineage, and later the mighty F-105 Thunderchief, the Thud, would trace its design DNA back to the P-47. In every one of them lay the same philosophy: durability, range, and firepower first. In Germany, where the P-47 had once been mocked, surviving Luftwaffe pilots later spoke with admiration. Many admitted that it had been one of the hardest opponents to kill. Its speed in a dive, its toughness, and its sheer firepower made it a nightmare to face. You could empty your guns into it, and it would still climb away,